Hi, I'm Laura Fell, and welcome to my interview series talking mental health and creativity. This week, I'm joined by writer, broadcaster, and journalist Laura Barton. Having been a feature writer and a music columnist for The Guardian for over a decade, Laura now writes for a myriad of publications, including The Observer, The Independent, 1843 magazine, The Telegraph, Uncut, and The Financial Times. In 2010, she published a novel, 21 Locks, which received a Betty Trask Award, and her second book, Sad Songs, is due for publication in May 2022 and is an inquiry into the history, science, and musicology of our love of sad music. In the meantime, this autumn, Laura also has another series of Laura Barton's Notes on Music on BBC Radio 4, which will be well worth tuning into. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Initially, kind of before coming back to that, I guess I just wanted to ask you a bit about your own personal experience of mental health. Mm-hmm. When that was something you kind of became aware of, I guess, or if that's something you struggled with, when you can trace that back to.
Yeah, I think I first had probably like quite a serious depressive period in my life, sort of after sixth form. So I would have been 18, and I was quite severely anorexic, and I was just, incredibly depressed. And I think I'd just gone from the sort of absolute joy of sixth form and I'd been very unhappy at school, and then loved sixth form so much. And then I'd taken a gap year before going to university.
Right.
And I think I just was sort of grieving that, really. And I didn't quite know. I think anorexia is something different, really. But that was the first time I'd sort of felt that feeling, or had that experience. And that continued for quite a few years. So, yeah.
And when you were going through that, did you have a sense of kind of that's what it was? Or, was that something that was talked about, or that you felt able to talk to others about at that time? Or was that something you were kind of going through quite in isolation?
I was very much in isolation. I had no idea how to talk to anybody about any of it, really. I'd gone to the Middle East and I had lived with 5 other girls, and I use that term very particularly because we felt like quite young, really. We're 19, but it was just such a weird experience for me. And they were lovely young women, but I had a lot of male friends when I was that age, and I missed that, and I missed people who were like me. And the Middle East is quite an intense place, and it was my first time living away from home, and I had this peculiar way of eating at the time, and it was all just quite intense, and Oxford's its own kind of weird, intense place. So it took until my great aunt died, and my great aunt was someone I was incredibly close to, and that sort of broke through everything, and I was sort of released from this numb period of my life, sort of 3 years of my life or so. And I broke up with my long-term boyfriend from home, and suddenly I was in the present. I was in the place I was supposed to be, and I suddenly enjoyed university, and I suddenly enjoyed food, and I suddenly, I could hear music again, and all those kinds of things. In that way of grief being, just unleashes that thing. It's funny, actually, just before speaking to you, I was writing up an article with a musician called Aruj Aftab, and she's just written a beautiful record called Vulture Prince, and it's about grief. And she was talking about the inferno of grief, and very much along the lines that you're dealing with, about how it affected her creativity and self, I guess. So yes, that was my early introduction to strange mental health episodes.
Is that something, Laura, that's carried on then for you throughout kind of the rest of your life, kind of experiences or bouts of depression, or those issues around food, or are they things that kind of you feel are left behind?
I think it's very hard to leave behind anything when you've had that kind of experience, especially if you've had it at a sort of formative age, because I think it's as if you've you've broken your leg and you're always therefore mindful of how you walk, do you know what I mean, or something like that. And it doesn't, you know, I think I'm always fearful of falling back into that pit that I was in at that time. And I had a much worse episode really when I was sort of my early to mid 30s, and I left my marriage and I left my job, and somebody said to me many years ago that actually you should only take one leg of the stool off the ground at the one time, and I think I took all 3 legs off the ground. So you know, you change your home and your relationship and your job, and it's just too much. But I think I felt that it was necessary. I had to take apart my entire life, really,
and kind of rebuild it.
Yeah, and I couldn't think of any way to do that other than to completely raise it, I think. But I mean, that was a really painful, difficult, incredibly difficult time in my life. I wasn't anorexic, but I was really obsessed with exercise. But it allowed me to become the person that I'm very happy to be now, I suppose. I feel very proud of, not that I'm saying I'm an amazing person, but I feel very proud of the fact that I had the confidence to do that and to rebuild myself in a way. And
well, absolutely, because it does take confidence, you know, that's kind of taking a real leap with yourself to kind of, as you say, take those legs off and rebuild from the ground up. You know, that's really kind of leaning into everything.
Yeah, I think I was very aware that a lot of people are offered opportunities to do that kind of thing and don't take them. And I didn't want to live sort of a life half lived, I suppose. And I read an article in The Guardian a few years back, and it was about how breaks in your personal narrative are actually really helpful for you, because then you can question sort of the narrative you've been carrying and whether or not it's your narrative, whether it's your parents' narrative or whatever. You will know all this stuff much better than I do. But I think one of the best things I did was I broke my own narrative that I've been carrying for a long time. And then I just sat in the space. I didn't try and build like a new narrative immediately. I just was like, oh, what happens now? We'll just see. So, yeah.
And I guess it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's that part of stepping back and looking at everything and seeing it with the wide angle lens is the thing that can feel the most daunting to do, and the thing that we then avoid. But actually, when you do it, it sounds like there was a real sense of stillness in that.
Yeah.
Space for
I
you.
mean, there was a sense of deep catastrophe and grief for a long time, but then I just reached this point of stillness. And, you know, I've done an awful lot of therapy in the last 10 years or so that was immensely helpful.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask about kind of what you found helpful along the way, kind of navigating these issues with the depression, with the food, with that kind of sense of loss and the forms that took. Has that been quite a central part of that kind of process for you, kind of the source of therapy? Yeah. And I guess I wonder kind of what else has helped as well. What do you feel has helped to kind of rebuild that foundation after you took the legs off?
I think therapy is like one of the most remarkable things in the world, and anybody who can do it should do it, you know. And I still go to therapy now, and I have the most incredible therapist who's really helped me through a difficult few years. This more recently, the therapist I was seeing then was quite different, but I don't think that I could have left my marriage or my job or any of those things without him there. Yeah, that was Gestalt therapy actually, but it was like a melding of different therapies. And I found actually a more dynamic form of therapy quite helpful to me. I had been to, I forgot what kind of she was. I went to somebody else for a little bit, and she didn't really ask me anything. And I do not have trouble being silent. So I would just sit in someone's room for sort of 50 minutes and then go away and think, I need someone to ask me questions and to, you know, so that was really helpful. Travel is really helpful for me always. Movement is, you know, I said about exercising a lot, but actually exercise is hugely helpful to me. If I don't exercise, I mean, I do hot yoga, and if I can't do that, I get really very quickly sort of wound up. walking, and then I went on a massive road trip, like a solo road trip, which sounds like the hugest indulgence in the world. That's like always the biggest, most, if anything goes wrong in my life, that's what I try and do if I can. So yeah, and space. I mean, I'm quite a solo person, really. I mean, I have a huge social life, but I have to keep a lot of space for myself. I can be quite quickly overwhelmed, I think. At that sort of second time that I went through the really difficult time, for a long time, I couldn't read or write or listen to music.
Oh, wow, okay. That was just kind of felt like a door that had been closed and you couldn't open up again.
Yeah, it was really disturbing to me because I couldn't listen to a song and hear a song as it was meant to be heard. It was as if the music were curdling, and obviously my job is writing and largely writing about music, so it was really difficult. So it took a long time for that to come back, really. Yeah.
And was that a gradual process? Because it sounds like a strange experience, and I guess quite an unsettling one when, as you say, that's what you do as a living, and I guess quite a central part of identity, or certainly an important self, and I wonder how did that kind of come back? Was that similar kind of moment of it switching like you talked about before?
No, it was like sometimes I went through a really silent period where I just couldn't really listen to the radio. The only thing I felt able to watch or to do was watch old episodes of Lewis, a program I had never seen before, and that obviously we can no longer watch because Lawrence Fox is in it. But for some reason, that was the only thing I could watch. I mean, this is the kind of weird state I was in. But then music came back in sort of little crackles, like almost like you could hear on the radio a little burst of music would come into my head, like a lyric or something. And I started writing them down, almost like what is the connection between them? I mean, I really can't sort of say enough what a state I was in. I was living in this flat that I'd moved into, and I didn't have any furniture because I'd left it all at my marital home. And I was having to sort of sleep on the floor, and I didn't, because I couldn't find the wherewithal to go, and my brain would not allow me to go and buy furniture. Do you know what I mean? And my mum was like sending me cutlery. Do you know what I mean? It was just so bleak and disorientating. And I did attempt suicide twice during that period and just before, because I just thought, I don't know who I am anymore, or what that self that we talked about with writing and music was gone, and I just thought, well, I don't have any purpose now, really. Yeah. So, and then I sort of gave myself a time scale in which to get better, almost, or I sort of made a deal with myself that I was allowed to kill myself in a few months' time if things weren't better, but I had to do something to see if I could make it better. So that was when I went on a road trip, and I went and I gave myself a task of going to the deep south of America and sort of looking at different genres of music and how they treated sadness. So it was like a sort of assignment to myself.
Which is now culminated in sad songs.
Yes, yeah. So that will be out next year. But yeah, I didn't think it would really work. It was just trying to make it work. Yeah. So yes.
And it did work, and it kind of did that kind of process then reignite that self, kind of like reawaken that part of you then around.
Yeah, I became a very different writer though, and one that I am happier to be. I've always written in a very intimate style, but I think actually I didn't give much of myself away. People felt they knew me probably from my writing, but they didn't really know me. And I remember I started very slowly to write a few short pieces for The Guardian and for Radio 4, in which I taught very openly about things. And the response to those was always so overwhelming in a beautiful way, that it just encouraged me to write more in that way. I always say now when I teach writing, the best thing I can say to anybody is don't flinch. And I think that's the same thing that I measure of my own writing when I'm writing, is particularly a personal piece, is like keep it sort of straight and true, you know.
I mean, it's interesting kind of talking about that then, this question around, you know, do you feel there is an interrelationship between kind of mental health and your creativity? Because it sounds like those experiences and coming out of the other side of them, you know, you're saying you became a very different writer and one that you're happy to be. And I wonder what you make of that relationship between mental health and creativity. Do they kind of meet for you?
They absolutely meet. And in so many people I interview, that is a huge, huge issue for so many people, and a strange dance between the two. I get worried if I feel, I don't want to say just sad, but I get worried that words could be taken from me again, you know, and that I could lose my creative self again. Which sounds very grand, but you know, even if you're not a writer, even if you are a dinner lady, having some sort of creative self or sense of identity is so profound. And that's been, you know, when I was little, I was a really late speaker.
Okay.
And so I wrote instead of speaking. And so I think it's, you know, writing's just always been my thing. So the idea that that was gone was just devastating. So yes, in terms of, I don't think you have to suffer to make great art. I think that that's misleading.
Yes, yeah.
But I think you have to have the capacity to feel, and I think you have to have compassion and empathy. And I suppose what happened to me was my capacity to feel was taken away to a large extent. I was quite numb. So,
I mean, when that capacity came back, and I guess you did write more personal pieces. I'm thinking of the piece you wrote on your solo IVF, The Guardian, last year. I guess I wondered how it felt to write that piece, and what led you to write that piece. Was it this kind of feeling of this kind of reconnection to that part, and you kind of felt the need to express that? Was it about kind of challenging yourself not to flinch?
They're funny pieces. Nearly all the most intimate pieces I've written have happened very quickly and in a very straightforward way. I sort of carry them around in my head almost without knowing I'm going to write them, and then they just write them very quickly. Whether that's radio or written. And that one came about, I was so adamant I wasn't going to write about IVF. It just felt so hackneyed, and you know, and it felt private. I mean, I still wanted to keep something back. And then weirdly, the editor of The Guardian emailed me while I was in Crete, and she got me out of office, and she sent another message saying, I really hope that you're okay wherever you are. And I replied and told her what I was doing. I was being quite open with people about that knew me, what I was doing. And she said, if ever you want to write about it, let us know.
Right.
And so I thought about it and decided, and it was only because sentences had already started forming in my head while I was there. Okay. You know, and I found myself, particularly because it was a foreign country with a different language, I found myself making sense of this strange world through my own language. And I wrote that piece in about like a couple of hours, really fast.
Oh, wow.
An hour and a half after I got back. And everyone always goes, God, you must have like drafted that, or that must have been very painful to write. And it wasn't, it was a release. It was very straightforward to do. I think
almost like it was already there and just waiting to be.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd written about miscarriage before for both The Guardian and Radio 4. So I think there was some sort of knowledge in me that writing about that had been helpful. Yeah. And I didn't really consider it too much. That's only something that's occurred to me afterwards.
And were those pieces also kind of a feeling of release? kind of write about that. And did they come quite quickly also, the pieces that you wrote around miscarriage and your experience?
Yeah. That one, both of those. They always just sort of, I might have been slightly carrying them in my head anyway, but sometimes I just go for a walk and they take shape, and then or a drive, and suddenly there they are. They're strange. They're a totally different feeling to writing something else.
And I mean, I wonder, I wanted to ask you about kind of your experience of the stigma around those difficult conversations and mental health. And, it's something that I'm really passionate about challenging, and I think it's getting better. But I guess, the pieces that you've written, I've read them, and they're very honest and touching, and you give a lot of yourself in those pieces. I wondered how it felt for you once they were published, for them to be out in the world, kind of that vulnerability. I wondered what that was like for you.
That IVF one was insane. I mean, it went on for days and days and days, and I still get asked to sort of speak at conferences or write another thing about it or whatever. It was quite overwhelming at the time because it was in the pandemic, and I just hadn't seen anyone for so long. So, and I lived by myself. So it was sort of suddenly to have, from going from sort of silence and isolation to having thousands of people messaging me.
Yeah.
And I remember my friend took me swimming. We went swimming in the river near my old house, and it was such a relief to just be away from my phone. And because people, whenever you write a piece like that, it's like writing a song or something, someone connects with it and they have to tell you their own story. And that is so precious and so beautiful, and you don't want to crush it or dismiss it or just say thanks. You have to engage.
There's quite a responsibility that comes with that response. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember interviewing Sharon Van Etten, and she's sort of trained, I think, in therapy now, because she was saying that people would talk to her so often after shows, or if they ran into her, and she felt, I don't have the tools to help you. I'm just a singer. So she felt she had to train in it. But I felt more powerful than vulnerable, really. There's such a power in telling the truth. And I think my old life, when I said that I sort of reinvented myself, I felt there were so many layers and contortions and compartments to my life that just had made it untenable, really, I think, to live like that anymore. And so that's what I mean about being straight and true and unflinching. And some of that, I don't want to be one of those writers who only ever talks about themselves or is purely confessional. And I keep a lot of my own life back and my own thoughts, but there are certain things, it's a bit like if you press on something and it hurts, and I kind of feel that's almost the thing to write about, because other people will feel the same.
Yeah. And I guess also that sense of it, when you press on something and it hurts, there's kind of process there for yourself as well. And it sounds like there has been a part of your writing that has been cathartic, or kind of enabled you to kind of make sense of things. This idea of it kind of coming out in 2 hours in a form that feels so kind of polished, and kind of it makes sense. It's almost that thing of kind of this thing that feels really intangible, like a fog that we're grabbing at to try and kind of put it all together. And has that been your experience?
Yes, I think actually if you're holding it in, you start to feel angry. And there are a lot of things in that article that I felt angry about, whether that was sort of relationships with past partners, or I quote an India Knight line from one of her books about people who don't have children, and basically how small and boring their lives are. And I'd carried that thought. I'd first read that, and it actually makes me tearful now to think about it, because I'd first read it, I'd just miscarried twins like a couple of months before, and I first read it and I thought it was such a painful thing to read and such a thoughtless thing to read. But what do I do with that anger and that upset other than tweet about it? Get into some kind of sort of beef with India Knight, or other people or whatever. And I thought, but I held on to it, and then it was weird writing the article. I thought, oh, this is the perfect place to just put it there. And once I'd done that, I could breathe again. I put down the anger of it, and even with ex-partners, I'm still angry, but I but I also have a sense of grace with it all, I suppose.
So it's almost like a weight that you don't have to carry in the same way anymore once it's kind of been named.
Yeah, I mean, you said about the fog, and it is a fog, but also I think it can be that sort of almost like a squid ink, horrible, bilious thing inside you. And you can put it into something beautiful that helps other people, and there it can live, you know.
In terms of that, do you feel at all, or have you ever felt then a responsibility to kind of to be part of that process of helping people, or to kind of writing about these things?
I don't really feel a responsibility, and not about that. No, I don't want to, because I think as soon as it becomes in service of something else, then you are flinching a little bit, I think, in your writing. I do feel a responsibility to other. I recently made a documentary about Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was about a group of women who created this health book in the States in the 70s, really. And it was about women's understanding of their bodies. And it followed on from another doc I'd made about the Jane Collective, which is this collective of women who helped give illegal abortions when abortion wasn't available in the US. And I feel responsibility to those kinds of, to women, basically, and to female experience. I feel the documentation and the articulation of female experience is so important. And even now, we're only just starting to understand how women feel, or trans people, you know, as well. It's a narrative, a voice that isn't white and male. It's the obvious thing to say, but that's the only responsibility I really feel in writing.
But maybe then also a responsibility to yourself to kind of then not be unflinching, in that way.
To yourself, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know if I'm hiding, I also know now, you know, at the minute I've been doing an awful lot of interviews, like journalistic interviews. And if I do too many of those and I don't do enough of my own personal work, I start to feel a bit twitchy and weird. So I have a responsibility to myself to, you know, I don't keep a diary, and I never have, but I think those intimate pieces, and you need a little bit of that sometimes. It just creates space in your head, and it's a different way of using your voice and language and breath and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. To ask a bit more about your book that's coming out next year, Sad Songs. I found it quite interesting. I was reading the blurb, and I've already pre-ordered my copy.
Oh, bless you.
And you know, you talked about kind of this, you know, this is what happened. I left my job, I left my marriage, I left my home. You know, I lost these things, and you know, and then you kind of said, then I lost my mind, and all of this loss and grief, and it, you know, and exploring that alongside kind of how different genres of music deal with sadness. It sounds so fascinating.
So I contained it within the narrative of that sort of, largely of that road trip I mentioned, of sort of going through the South and sort of, you know, going to Al Green's church and going to Graceland. I end up at Graceland because of the Paul Simon song, which was one of the first songs that little, I said about those little crackles of song that came through to me. That was one of the songs to me, and it's a song I've always loved. So it was that bit about losing love is like a window in your heart. Everybody sees you're blown apart. Everybody feels the wind blow. And so I looked at just those different genres as I went through the different, you know, I went shape note singing, for example, in North Carolina. And it was sort of within that journey, sort of, you know, looking at the blues, but in a slightly tangential about the blues by a white person. So, but it's sort of looking at how, when I isolated those art forms, how they affected me, whether I could find any sustenance in them, and also what connected them, that sense of loss. And, you know, it's I kept it geographically quite close, but I also mention, fado, or I always mispronounce it, sita. It's Ethiopian form of music, or like ghazals in South Asia and that kind of thing. So it's not encyclopedic, and it's not complete, and I'm not that kind of writer, but I do try to address the fact that we are quite often drawn to those kinds of music that can articulate something that we can't do in words, which as a writer is actually probably the most fascinating thing to me. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does completely. And I think, that idea is so fascinating to me, that we lean into that, and I think that we really do. And I know that there are albums that I have on standby, for
yeah. Oh no, God, completely. What are your ones?
Blood on the Tracks is one.
Oh, hello, yes.
I mean, that's the top. That's like the breakup album. There's that amazing lyric, is it in Idiot Wind? I can't feel you anymore. I can't even touch the books you've read. And I think there's that sense of, I don't know if you experience this, but for me, if I'm going through a crisis, I do find it quite difficult to create anything. There's this kind of period of stasis. And that's where I find myself reaching for things, not only to articulate it, but I guess also to try and reignite that ability to articulate it myself. And does that kind of resonate for you?
Absolutely. I look for things to hold me almost through this sort of passage. And it's, another part of the book is really looking at sort of the science of it a little bit, and sort of why we gravitate towards certain notes even, or, that kind of stuff. So there is a reason why we love Idiot Wind. But yeah, exactly. I'm very much the type of person who will listen to one song on repeat, and or one album on repeat. And, I once in that journey, actually, I drove, I think it was about 6 hours to Atlanta. I got in the terrible traffic and just listened to the same Deptford Goth songs, two Deptford Goth songs. Not your obvious sad songs, but they were just what completely held me together for a long period of time. It's strange.
And I read that piece that you wrote also about the national song when you were driving. And yeah, Terrible Love. It's actually a live version of it. But that's been another song that's seen me through some quite hard times. As you say, the ones that you return to is one that I often return to. And I think songs like that are quite fascinating when they don't actually spell out what they're talking about always. It's just a sort of mood piece almost, or a feeling, or I'm not actually one generally for sort of really clear narrative songs when I'm in that frame of mind, because I probably just need not somebody else's story, I need to find my own, so I sometimes just need to feel that pain rather than find solace in a song or hope. I'm not yet at that stage with it. Do you know what I mean? I think there's probably a whole other class of songs that are about the hopeful moment. Coming back to the idea of creativity and mental health, and what this sense of kind of not flinching, is that something that you feel is kind of quite core now to your creative practice? Is that a kind of core shift in terms of that's your mindset writing going forward?
Yes, absolutely, particularly for personal pieces. For other pieces too, I've got a new level of confidence that I didn't have before. I don't want to be dramatic and say you walked through the fire and you've done whatever, but it's just this sort of, you've lived and I know what I'm doing, and it took me a long time to get to that point, but I think a lot of it was through that unflinchingness and not trying to woo anybody or make it softer or sweeter for anybody. I just want to tell someone how it was, and sometimes the way to do that, I think, is in a beautiful way, in a
sure,
in a way that's healing. But yeah, I think that is core to me, but it's also a confidence in generally creating space for myself to write and to, all those components we talked about.
Yeah.
to create a healthy space for myself of therapy and yoga and eating. Well, I mean, it's the boring stuff, really.
It's so fundamental.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's particularly if you are in any way connected to the music world, you can be unhealthy in, you know, 2.4 seconds, and it's just being careful about your mind, I think, a lot of the time, and knowing what the ingredients are to make you still and happy and able to create. Yeah, it's very dull. I don't know, but I also don't know why it took me so long to realize that what other people were saying was true.
But I guess it's that difference, I think, isn't it, between kind of thinking a thing and feeling a thing, or interacting with it on an intellectual level. Like, you know, I can understand that, but I think you have to kind of experience it to really
prove it on your pulses, or whatever Keats said. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wondered what you might want to share about things that you found helpful, or things that you find grounding, or that kind of helped you to kind of get through, kind of process and cope.
I will say the very obvious one is nature, and slowing down, noticing the details. That's very much what I did when I was in Crete doing the IVF stuff, you know, and it's something I talked to my therapist a lot about, and it's something I do now to calm myself down. If I'm, you know, I've just moved house and I've moved to a city, and it's, you know, I've moved back to London and it's overwhelming. I've lived in a really quiet place for sort of 5-6 years, and I've had to really work to do that the last couple of weeks, because it's just like, whoa, just to walk around my neighborhood and look at, you know, irises and wisteria and stuff. So that I find there are certain voices that I turn to. So sort of Rebecca Solnit, I read a lot, Joan Didion, people like that, voices that just feel, and various poets, voices that just feel grounding to me. And one of the things I always say to myself is, remind myself, is that life is messy, and that's one of the best things you can accept in your life, that life is messy, and that's where the good stuff happens. You know, I think I was one of those real perfectionists growing up, you know, and I had to be good and neat and well behaved, and you know, I think as soon as you accept that that's not life, it's very freeing. And just saying no to people, boundaries. I always call it policing my borders, which probably makes me a little bit more stern than I am. But yeah, just saying, no, I can't do that. I can't see you. I can't be what you need me to be.
Yeah. Which comes back to that idea of kind of taking space, or allowing ourselves to, take up the space we take up, you know, boundaries, what is okay, what's not okay, and living by that. From that
completely. I mean, I struggle, that's something I still struggle with, how much space am I allowed to take up is my biggest struggle, and always has been. And it probably does connect to sort of anorexia and all those kinds of things, really, because that's sometimes an issue of space. And my instinct is always to make myself small. So anything I can do to just even physically create space for myself, whether that's saying no to people, whether it's living by myself, whether it's going away by myself if I'm in a relationship, whether it's going to yoga and saying you cannot contact me for 90 minutes in a day, or turning off your email, or, you know, I've got Instagram on my phone. I don't have any social media or notifications or anything.
Right.
Because I don't have any sounds on anything. You know, I'm basically sounding really peculiar, but I just have to police my borders quite strictly, because I can be a very porous person. So I'd be interested to know how, and I'm sure you go into this, but sort of how you balance creativity and doing the job you do. I mean, whenever I speak to my therapist, I'm always like, how do you not take that everywhere with you?
Yeah, I mean, on a practical level, supervision helps. So I have clinical supervision where I can talk about, I work, it is hard because I work quite relationally. So I think that the important part of therapy, curative factor, if you will, although that sets up the idea that, you know, there is a problem that needs to be cured. But I think in a relationship where you feel held, seen, supported, where you're both being transparent and congruent with each other. I think that's the powerful thing. So I do find that I have to be particularly wary of my boundaries, because I do work in a way where I bring a lot of myself in, not through self-disclosure, but just kind of being in the space.
Yeah, no, my therapist is the same. My old therapist wasn't. My current therapist is like that, and I find it incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Working with him, but I do think about how much of that do you have to take away. So,
yeah, I mean, I do lots of things that maybe sound a bit silly, but they're kind of quite ritualistic. And I remember they talked to us about this when we were training about, you know, one therapist said that she'll fill a glass of water at the start of a session and empty it at the end. And I do, and I do a kind of breathing technique where I breathe in and I imagine each client, and I kind of say, see you next week, and then I breathe out. And so I do these kind of grounding things, I suppose. And working from home has been more difficult because I'm in this little corner, but I'm not here in this corner for anything else. And for me, it's just making sure that it's that classic thing of, you know, on airplanes you have to put the mask on yourself first to. So for me, self-care has been a fundamental thing, and that's something that I've struggled with. And I think for me, through my training, that was my core learning. I have a history of OCD, anxiety and eating disorder, which meant that I spent a long time not listening to my body, and where my boundaries were and what I needed and what it was telling me. So I've had to really learn to tune into that and to know when I need to kind of, now I try and exercise for at least half an hour every day because I just know it helps. So for me, it's that idea of kind of my work takes energy. So what puts the energy back in? Exactly. So again, it's that balance. It's kind of filling back up the tank. Yeah.
I mean, it's not dissimilar really in my world when you're interviewing a lot of people. It's so exhausting. It's the same, I imagine, or not quite the same, as because people aren't always divulging deep, dark things. But it's energy, isn't it?
But it's also, it's a strange thing. I mean, when I talk about it, I worry that it makes me sound a bit kind of twisted in a way, but like, I also find my job very energizing, you know, and I think there's a real, I guess what it takes on an energy level is offset by, I guess, the privilege that I feel being part of that process and being able to do the work. And I think it's funny, you're also constantly learning, and often clients come into my practice that kind of touch on my own stuff, and, you know, you can work through that in supervision. And so that's kind of what I love about it, in the same way as music, you know, you're constantly learning and reflecting. And so it's not just that I'm giving all of this and getting nothing back. I get a huge amount.
Is it like playing with another person you've never played with musically?
Being with a client in therapy? Yeah, I guess so, because in the same way when you're playing with a new musician, you're having to find your way of communicating in the sense of kind of the way we do with any new relationship, because it is a relationship, it's a therapeutic relationship. You kind of have to figure out what that looks like for you. You know, there are some clients where humor will be a really integral part of the therapy, and there are, you know, others where that won't have a role, and, you know, other places where silence feels really holding and containing, and some clients where silence feels really punitive. And so it's you're doing this kind of collaborative process of learning about each other and how to kind of hold the space.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I love it. It's really and I think coming back to your question, I think all that it gives me is also part of how I'm able to kind of leave it there. You know, so there are those quite practical boundaries, but I think that, and also this sounds weird and other people said it to me and it didn't make sense. It's that thing again, it made sense to think it, but I feel it now. You do just get used to it on a level. And I guess kind of the more that those boundaries become habit of, you know, I'm going here and then I'm going to do this class after this block of clients, or I'm going to, you know, do this breathing, or I'm going to, you know, make sure I see a friend, you know, or if I've had a particularly difficult session, I might write something down. Or I think self-care for me is the most important thing.
You know what, that is one thing that I should have mentioned before about one thing that helps is routine. And it's so boring, but exactly that. It's the more you do those things, those rituals, whatever. You know, the form of yoga that most helped me when I was at my darkest time was Bikram, and I hate saying that because obviously he's a creep, but Bikram is the most routine. It's the same 26 postures done twice in a really hot room, and there's still. I went back to my first class since the pandemic started this week, and just the routine of that, those same 26 postures, that same dialogue, are freeing to me, which I find really fascinating. As someone who's creative and likes to make connections and spontaneous things, it's weird how actually sort of a rigidity allows that, I think.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Yes, you too. Thank you. I really love that you're doing this. So yes, let me know when everything goes live, because I'd love to hear the other ones too.